So, hello everyone. We'll be starting with the final session soon. And hello to everyone also joining us via live stream to the final session of the Helsinki Security Forum, the final session will be fittingly looking what the future of Europe and particularly European security might hold. I'm Veera, I'm the Director of Foresight at Sitra, Finland's Innovation Fund, and I'll be moderating the panel. I'm joined by three outstanding experts and thinkers. Dr. Rosa Balfour, Director of Carnegie Europe. Her fields of expertise include European politics, institutions, and foreign and security policy. Her current research focuses on the relationship between domestic politics and Europe's global role, and we'll be touching upon domestic politics certainly in this panel. And then we have Oliver Moody, Berlin Bureau Chief at the Times. Since 2018, Oliver has been covering Germany, Northern and Central Europe from Berlin. Oliver is the author of a very timely book, Baltic, the Future of Europe, which was also discussed yesterday. And then we have Niklas Helwig, who is a leading researcher at FIIA, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, needless to say, and an associate professor in international relations at Tampere University. His research focuses on EU foreign and security policy, German strategic culture, as well as EU-US relations. If we could have the big picture behind us, then that would be wonderful. So at Sitra, we have approached security through the lens of foresight, trying to understand the big picture of change and how it could help strategic thinking and long-term policy. In an age of chaos, complexity and hyper-rapid transformation. Now, as we've heard in the previous sessions and looking at this picture, the major issues facing Europe obviously include the intensification of global superpower competition, the increasingly intertwined nature of technology with security, changes in social cohesion of societies, concerns of continuity in climate and nature policy, and the emergence of geoeconomics as an instrument of power. Now, this setting feeds short-termism and reactiveness, leaving perhaps too little room for societal debates and discussion. Now, thus in our panel, we have the chance to take the long-term perspective. This is a question to all our panelists. What is your take on this big picture of change? And you can actually see it over there as well, so you don't need to stretch your neck. And what do you think are the developments identified fundamental from a European perspective, 10 to 30 years? And what might be the great opportunity as we've been discussing challenges? So perhaps we should look at opportunities as well. Rosa, what would you like to point out? What are we not paying attention to now?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start from that, and then on that basis we can move on to the opportunities, because I think, and this, first of all, let me just say, this study is a great study. I really, I thought it was very provocative, very well done, and a good methodology. So I'd recommend everyone take a look at it. And also, let me just say, these past couple of days have been really intense and amazing policy discussions. But what we've been missing is the politics. And I think that's where we are in a little bit of a dark spot. Across, in advanced democracies and beyond, but let's just focus on Europe, there's a real crisis. There's a crisis of democratic systems and practices. There's a crisis of leadership. And the manifestation of this crisis is the rise of challenging parties or movements that are challenging the status quo, which makes it very hard to talk about, the hour of Europe. And I was mentioning to you earlier, I was in Brussels. I live in Brussels. I'm based in Brussels, and I was at the Draghi speech and the von der Leyen speech. And, and I've been watching Draghi for several months now, and I can see his increased irritation. Everybody knows what needs to be done, but nobody's doing it, right? So there's this huge gap between what is needed and what that chart tells us is needed. Between that and what people think or people are willing to do. And I think we need to see this as a deep crisis, as a systemic crisis, but through the analysis of it, we need to find new pathways to do things. So I think the old methods are no longer sustainable. But what we're seeing is that the sort of median point around which European governments manage to find a consensus and manage to move ahead is very much, minimum common denominator. Let's push this forward. The centre can just about hold, so let's push this forward, but we're going to do the minimum. So it's not transformative. And that means insufficient action on all the big crises that we see. But it also, in the long run, and not even such a long run, I mean, in the medium run, it's eroding even that shrinking centre, which means that if we don't change things, come 5 years' time, we're going to have a different type of political leadership, which will not be looking at those things in the way in which us in this community are looking at them.
Now, Oliver, you've been zooming on the Baltic area particularly, and if you're looking at that picture of change, do you think that is fitting in a sense that we see this as our operational environment? And then as a follow-up, I would ask you, is the frontline states, are they really the only ones that are feeling the danger enough, as was previously said here at the forum, that you can't, the policymakers are reluctant to do things if they feel that the populations are not feeling the danger enough?
I would definitely like to inject a note of optimism into this conversation, but the organizing principle of the book is very much that in order to get to that point, we really have to test our current assumptions to the point of destruction and work out how bad the situation that we are in now truly is. So if it's okay, I'd like to build on what Rosa said and talk a bit about the broader European framework and then come to the Baltic maybe later in the discussion. I'm sorry to answer a question about the kind of near to medium term future by retreating 500 or 600 years into the past, but I've just finished reading a new book about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is often held up as a cautionary tale for the European Union because it was a bunch of geographically, politically, confessionally diverse territories that were kind of very messily brought together into a semi-unitary state with no real kind of central focal point of identity. And crucially, one of its main mechanisms of governance was the notorious liberum veto, this idea that the parliaments of the minor nobility, the Schlachter, would elect the monarch, and they required absolute unanimity for every decision, which certainly towards the end made it very easy for foreign powers to bribe or use force to manipulate them and ultimately to partition the state out of existence. But there's been a shift in the historiography of the Commonwealth, and it's now recognized that it was actually a remarkably effective state, certainly for the first kind of 80 to 100 years, that basically reduced Muscovy to a vassal state for periods of the 1610s. And around the middle of the 17th century, it all went wrong. And what went wrong was climate change. Ironically, cooling in this case, it was the start of the Little Ice Age. It was disease. But above all, it was the consolidation and modernization of their neighboring powers while they were failing to keep pace with military innovation and to modernize their administration. The reason for this excursus is that when you read the excellent Sitra Foresight report, one of the organizing principles is the triangle of time, right? So on one of the sides, you have the push of the present, and you have the pull of the future, and then at the bottom, you have the weight of the past. And what struck me in every section of the report is how strong the pull of the weight of the past is in every factor, these kind of things that are slowing it down. And my big concern is very much aligned with Rosa's, actually, not just in the Baltic but elsewhere, that as the fiscal positions of pretty much every member state deteriorate, and as that leads to a squeeze on social spending, and that as the kind of national conservative or sovereigntist parties continue on a roll, as they go further along the ratchet of radicalization, as they start working better together, as they receive encouragement from the MAGA movement in the US, that the result in 5 to 10 years may not be just stasis, but regression or even disintegration, not just of the European Union institutions, but also of the kind of fundamental post-war architecture, including the kind of legal system that we've got used to and the concepts of human rights. So that is the kind of deep well of pessimism that I would like to try and climb out of later.
All right. Several questions came up to my mind, but we'll return to those. But I have to just comment that definitely we have a blueprint for Europe from history here, and a fantastic analogy. So let's get back to that later on. But Niklas, I mean, looking at the big picture of state change, what are we missing? What are we neglecting?
Yeah. Well, let me first start by saying that I think Sitra does very important work on this foresight. I think this is definitely something that we need, because it's difficult already to predict what the US president will do the next day or this afternoon. So it's really good that you are looking and the other actors are looking into this long-term perspective and really help us to also distinguish all the noise that we have in these daily conversations that come through our newsfeed from these longer-term trends. And I think you do an excellent job, and this picture shows this. And the first thing that came to my mind looking at this big picture of change is how comprehensive actually our understanding of security has to be these days. So the past days we already saw a couple of or many different facets of security, but here we bring in actually other elements, the social part, the environmental aspects, and I think this comprehensive picture of security is very important. So that's the first observation. And now I want to maybe highlight one aspect I see on this slide that I think is important, and then maybe add something that I think is maybe missing a little bit. So what I think really has to be highlighted as one of these changes in the future is this point on economic power politics intensifying. I think this is really one of the key developments that we have seen already in the last 10, 15 years, and that we will also see in the upcoming period. I mean, we all heard about weaponized interdependence, economic security, geoeconomics, and FIIA has done excellent, my colleagues at FIIA have done excellent work on geoeconomics especially, and this is not going away. Why? I think a lot of these geoeconomic strategies, they have been really successful, so they have been validated. When we think about Trump's tariff policies, he has been quite successful also in getting concessions out of partners. So that's one part, they are successful. And the other one is we see this crumbling of the international system. Venues like the WTO and others are playing less and less of a role in the future. So we will see this much more competitive stance when it comes to economic power politics. And I think this is especially an important part from our part of the world to recognize, because here in Europe we came out of this belief that economic and political issues can be decoupled from each other, that we believed in this openness of the international markets, and we really have to step up our game in this economic power competition. The second thing I want to mention that is now maybe somewhere hidden in this slide, but not directly, is the decline of the so-called liberal international order. So now I'm becoming a little bit academic, but you know, when we think about international order, there are three parts to this, and my colleague Ville Sinkonen at the Institute has written some interesting pieces on this. You can think about distribution of power, so who has the power to set rules, and do we see a multipolar order, do we see a bipolar order, or how does the order look like from a power distribution perspective? The second one is the institutional aspect. What can the United Nations do? What other kind of institutional arrangements do we see? But then there's this third aspect that I want to highlight, and that is the normative aspect. So what are actually the normative basic principles guiding our actions and that we want to uphold? And here I see that this liberal idea that was especially, of course, the Western idea, that this is now under a lot of strain. So when I look at the discussions of recent days here at the forum, the excellent discussions, my takeaway was when it comes to joint interests, also when it comes to whether it's security or whether it's the economy, the cooperation with the US is just fine. You know, if we have a common interest, common threat perception, that is fine. But the question is, what kind of norms and principles are in the background of this cooperation? Here I'm not so sure. So we see this shift towards transactionalism, we see this shift towards short-term deals, and not this idea that we also are a community of values, whether it's democratic values, rule of law, the integrity of states and borders. This is now put a little bit into question by domestic developments in the United States, but also by domestic developments that we see in Europe at the same time. So, and the point I want to end on with is that this is not just a question of like Sunday speeches and, you know, would be nice to have these values, but it's a security issue because our security and the way we are organized, integrated in the European Union, they are based on these principles of rule of law, of democracy, and if these go away, we go down a really dangerous path.
Thank you, Niklas. We will definitely return to the liberal order question, but I would continue with Oliver on the sort of the prospect where the big picture of change might be actually moving things along, and the weight of the past is not holding back as much. And at least I got the feeling from reading your book that Estonia, for example, is a perfect example of a nation that carries its history very sort of strongly on its shoulders, if one might say, but at the same time has decided that the pull of the future is stronger. So what would you say? Is it still in 10 to 30 years that this area, the Baltics, will be the hotspot of Europe in that sense?
A few weeks ago, I interviewed a Polish poet who had moved back to Warsaw from Berlin and asked him why he'd done it. And he said, well, in Germany, you think that the pinnacle of human civilization was reached somewhere under Helmut Kohl in the 1980s or 1990s, and it's all been downhill since then. And what I find electrifying and hopeful about especially the eastern Baltic Sea region is the fact that the end of history never happened. That in the space of the lifetimes of the people who are now in charge, the Iron Curtain has fallen, they have reasserted their independence, their economies have grown by more than an order of magnitude, they have found their way into the heart of the Western system and reached a point where they can now influence the entire Europeans' policies on some issues. And this idea that change is a fundamental component of the historic process, and if you are simply trying to retard that change, and if you have a purely defensive mindset that is about holding on to as much as you can preserve of what you had before, then you're going to get left behind, and the result will be relative decline. And I've been very encouraged by just how forward-looking the cultures of kind of strategic policy planning have been, not just in Finland, but in the Baltic states as well. And that is one of the ways in which I believe the region could really serve as quite a powerful and encouraging model for the rest of Europe.
Thank you. Now, if we zoom on the topic of possible futures of European security in a 10-year period, Niklas, you slightly touched upon that already on that topic, but you recently co-edited and published a paper of EU in an age of empires. And you focused on 3 points. The EU's internal credibility as a political project. This is something that, Rosa, you've researched as well. Its ability to hold the aforementioned principle approach with global partners on the rule of law and human rights, and its capacity to wield economic influence. I would add a couple of things on the list, migration for one, and then the question of policymakers engaging with citizens when it comes to giving, particularly I would say from the liberal side. I mean, we're seeing it, the engagement from the populist right perhaps more, but not from the liberal side. But would you just like to elaborate just briefly, Niklas, on that paper, and then I will let Rosa start with comments, or if these are the building blocks perhaps for stronger Europe.
Yeah. No, yeah, so yeah, the basic idea, the starting point was of the paper was that we had this observation that we live in an age of empire. So instead of an international system guided by these principles of territorial integrity, of non-interference, we are now in a system that is more hierarchical, where great powers have actually imperial strategies. Russia, China, and increasingly also the US, they question territories, they see spheres of influence, and they also influence politics, for example, through social media in Europe. And so that this is a fundamental change that Europe has to react to. And the main takeaway that we make there is, how should the EU react to that? It's by doubling down on its strong points, on this idea of being this liberal project in Europe, which it has to strengthen, of the idea that it stands for these principles internationally. Of course, it has not always been perfect in that, and we can discuss that obviously as well, but that there's still an interest for these principles, also in the so-called Global South. I think President Stubb mentioned that also in his introductory remarks, that they're actually interested in the menu that we serve, but they want to have also a seat at the table. So there is a potential still in these global partnerships. And third, that really the biggest resource that Europe can actually muster is its economic power, and it isn't perfect in that yet, because it hasn't integrated its single market. It could do more on fiscal integration, strengthening the euro, and be also more proactive in using this in this economic power competition that we're seeing. So these are the three elements that we see.
All right, thank you. So Rosa, what are your thoughts on these? Are these the three main building blocks, perhaps, for stronger Europe?
So, yes, if we want to look at the status quo, but if we want to be a bit more kind of imaginative, and we have contradictory trends, right? We have technology, climate; these are transnational. It requires international cooperation. So there's a strong case to be made for international cooperation. Then we have, and it's partly what Oliver was saying about Helmut Kohl and the sort of, we have a political class that is nostalgic, and then we have the new, and the new is actually quite iconoclastic, but it's not making a case for international cooperation. So, how do we position ourselves so that we can embrace the new, we can make sure that its consequences are not catastrophic for humanity, but quite the opposite, and make a case that is compelling and persuasive. So how do we do that? I actually think, the dominant narrative is this: we're moving into a world. Well, we are in a world of geopolitical competition, imperial empire building, spheres of influence, and it's not just China and Russia, but now the US has joined this as well. And many would argue, well, the EU needs to beef itself up. It has to be done at the European level. Let's be, and participate in this. And I actually think, I'm not entirely sure that this is the right sort of direction for Europe, because we have quite a unique structure that is the European Union. Maybe we can think about power in more diffuse ways, and maybe we can do things differently. So in that doing things differently, I definitely think, and in the context of international cooperation, the normative side is a dimension that the European Union and other countries should embrace, promote, and work with whoever's willing to work on these topics, even if it's transactional, but it's fine. But we're talking about international peace. We're talking about, the loss of life in Gaza. What can we do about that? We're talking about transitional justice. We're talking about climate and global public good. So I think that's one area where the EU could do more. But I think perhaps we need to be a bit unorthodox and think about areas where the EU can do less, right? And I refer to von der Leyen's State of the Union speech a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about housing policy. Why should the EU get involved in housing policy? That's down to local governments. And one of the reasons we are in this political predicament is that regional and local governments have been disempowered because of the policies chosen after the financial crisis. So why not resuscitate, it's very horrible words, subsidiarity, right? Let's call it something different, but let's talk about where decisions can be made at the appropriate level to address the real problems of people. And then I think, if one looks at migration, you mentioned, housing, health, access to health, and, at one level with, involving citizen participation, you can change the ways of carrying out democratic practices at the local level. And then you have perhaps a more technocratic, policy-oriented elite that is managing the big issues of international cooperation. Maybe we'll have a different balance in terms of how politics is organized. And maybe that is the European way to look at the future.
Now, I think this is incredibly important what you're saying about the question of power, because we tend to have this intuitive reaction now that because power is so centralized now in the US and obviously in the autocratic regimes, that we should sort of centralize power in the European Union as well. And we are not thinking about our system, our transnational system and regional system as anything, as strength, as something that are usually, at least they are near to people and they feel that they can perhaps have an impact. Oliver, what are your thoughts on that question of power?
As a Briton, I just instinctively take issue with the automatic equation between Europe and the EU. And I think the reality is that certainly in a security architecture context, we're now moving towards a world where the important decisions are not being made in Brussels. They're being multilaterally by various constellations like the Weimar Plus format or the coalition of the willing that bind in Norway or Britain and other kind of countries around the EU. And going back to Niklas's very important point about this more kind of hierarchical action by the kind of great powers, we talk about, how does Europe shape its relationship with the US? We also know that the Trump administration very much likes bilateralizing relationships. So we could end up with a situation where different countries in Europe have potentially very different relationships with the US, and some will be more semi-subordinate and others will end up being more independent.
So, can I just add, I don't disagree with him. And I think actually the short-term way forward is precisely through the coalition of the willing. And I don't think we should look at the European Union as an end in itself. So I definitely think that. But if you want to look towards the future, I'm also thinking what are the things that can give value to what we're doing? And I think some of them can be managed in a framework in which international cooperation or European cooperation has a sort of governance framework, which the coalition of the willing at the moment is, it has it, but it's kind of, it's weaker.
So if I understand the panel correctly, we wish to embrace the complexity of and different levels of power, but then we come to the question of engaging with citizens, and it's another thing that it's something that quite intuitive these days, that policymakers want to make things simpler and not explain the complexities of power. Niklas, do you have any thoughts? And then I would warn the audience that we'll be taking questions soon before we go to the final leg of our panel.
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts. So I mean, it's a bit boring now for the last panel to not be disagreeing and not be arguing, but I completely agree with the 2 points that you raised. That I think what we wanted to highlight in the paper as well, it's not about a European superstate, that goes deep into housing policy and health, and but that these principles of subsidiarity should be still the basic idea, and that we build up this legitimacy. That I think that's a very key point, that the EU. The EU is strong on certain things and maybe keeps out of other things to keep the legitimacy of the whole project going. And but on this point, on the economy, on the single market, I think there are really important parts where, by definition, trade policy, the EU is just an important player and has to become better, and these pieces have to be strengthened. And I think that goes hand in hand what you are saying about how do we get more of a buy-in to these political processes. I think, yes, it is a complex system, of course, but there are also some really concrete things about it, like the single market and benefits that come with it for citizens, for private actors, for companies, and where there could be also future gains to be made when we think about the digital aspects of the single market, which is not completed yet. So I don't see the difficulty also to show that this has real positive effects on day-to-day life, despite complexities of the system. One point still, I think that was quite interesting by Rosa, of like that there's this new generation not thinking about this international engagement anymore in the same way as it was done in the past. And I think this is a really important point that we have to think about the effects of generational change and how that affects the future of that we are looking at. And I think the current or future policymakers, they will grow up and will be formed by these experiences that we see right now. And there is this danger that they will be even less engaging in this kind of like, more cooperative international relations.
Very good. Let's park the aspect of intergenerational policy and decision making still, and return to that in the final leg. But please, I see a hand over there, and then there's Terry and the other lady. So wonderful. We have plenty of questions. Should we probably take them all back to back? Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating conversation. I have a question, maybe mainly to Niklas, but I'm happy to hear the others' view as well. What I worry about is that the EU wasn't really made for this age of empires, that the EU is supposed to sort of like work according to a win-win logic. It negotiates in good faith most of the time and so on. So what will it take to adapt the EU for this era? And then to the whole panel, sort of more broadly, what if the EU becomes sort of like the last bastion or bubble of the old sort of rules-based order? Is that feasible? Like, can we keep it up in our bubble here? Does it make any sense, or will it just be sort of crushed from the outside forces? Thank you.
Thank you. Terry, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Terry Schultz, and I will sound very unintellectual after Mina, but my question is exactly that we can talk about all of these ideas and all of these explanations, and from my vantage point in Brussels, it still all comes down to this horrible situation that we're in, where in the personal meetings, the European representatives, and I would specifically be most interested because the last question was about the EU, about NATO. You still have Mark Rutte then going and saying all of these things just to keep President Trump, one single person, happy. So we can discuss this intellectually, and in the end, we've seen time and again that it comes down to that. So I'm personally interested then, the counterpoint to Mina's question, about how you think that's going to work at NATO. How is this going to turn out? All of these things that have been given for this very simple reason, to keep him literally feeling good on that day. How's that going to work out for us? That's my question.
Right. So good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Katja Herman, and I'm actually one of the youth delegates of this forums edition. So I got totally the call from Niklas on the younger generations, of course. And right. With that being said, I will try to keep it a little bit short. But I would like to challenge and also invite some reflection on what you just posted there as an image. And actually, Oliver marvelously pointed out, in an image of pessimism, right? And the last project that I did was a NATO 2099 project, was a comic book, at the NATO Defense College, which actually challenged exactly this, the dichotomy between pessimism and optimism. And so far what I've heard in these 3 days is kind of like a very pessimistic aura in which we tend to create a reality of stalemate in which we present the problem. And even that, if I see the title of this panel is The Future of European Security, not the European security of the future. So we try to already get involved in and be in this bubble of stalemate in which instead of presenting dual-use technologies, present opportunities. Digitalization creates or connects different societies, different cultures. We tend to problematize our reality, and hence we cannot move forward, and we cannot create the future that we want, right? It might sound a little bit idealistic, right? Of course, but after all, creativity is what maintain us afloat in the everyday life, right? To fight this reality. So I would like to challenge these to the panel and to invite some reflection as well. I think young generations, this is what we need, to be presented with an alternative that is not a pessimistic. By the way, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had a lot of great elements, as you mentioned, but inviting this, a creative future doesn't hurt at all, right? Thank you.
No, absolutely. Fantastic question. And let's start with the last one, in fact. What are your thoughts? Oliver, you look very reflective.
Well, I'm sorry to cheat on Sitra, but the Finnish government published a report on the future last week, I think on Friday. This is something that it has been doing on a regular basis since the early 1990s. And it sets out 4 scenarios for what the world might look like in 2045. And the first of those is this kind of fantastically utopian kumbaya world where we all join hands and climate change resolves itself and Robbie Williams never dies. Okay. Number 2 is the tech barons world, where essentially all of the meaningful parts of sovereignty have accrued to the people that control the technologies that are the fabric of our lives, which is potentially an extremely dark place to be. Number 3 is the world of blocks, which is very close to the kind of hierarchical quasi-imperial model that Niklas was talking about. And number 4 is this almost like Hieronymus Bosch painting of a world where all of the structures that we have predicated our politics on completely fall apart, including NATO, and it's kind of a point where even the nation state is struggling to maintain its coherence as kind of individual regions and even cities start trying to maintain their survival. And if we look at that and think, how do we try and maintain optimism in those scenarios? I think you can start by considering what do we need in each of those scenarios that we have now and that we can build on. And if you think about something like technological sovereignty, we do very much have the base of expertise in Europe to be able to start positioning ourselves for that world now. If you start thinking about block formation, then we can start thinking again about what we have to offer, but also what we're in a position to demand from other blocks, how we can be more assertive in navigating that world. And then if it really does go into the very dark place of the last scenario, then in this very region, in this particular country, we have a fantastic range of policies and toolkits and ways of thinking about resilience that can be translated across Europe and would set us up, I think, very well for that particular future.
Thank you, Oliver. Would you like to pitch in, Rosa? And then we'll have the question which was addressed, Niklas, to you.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind also saying something about the empire, but one of the most quoted sentences from Gramsci is pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will, which I think is very relevant. It's very hard for people in the jobs that I'm in to be optimistic. But I do think, earlier today, someone, I think it was today or yesterday, it's all in a bit of a blur, but someone was, giving out the ingredients of European resilience and European strength vis-a-vis Russia. We have it all, but perhaps there are things that we need to address a bit more aggressively. And, I would say, and I'm not sure demography featured that much in your report.
No, and we'll be touching on at the end of the panel. You're right, it didn't. No,
I think, and I remember I chaired Rutte for the first public speech that he gave, which was pretty perfect as a speech. But there's one point I thought, why did you raise it? I didn't ask him that on the panel. He says we have to make sacrifices on the social front, welfare front, in order to pay for defense. And I actually think that's a wrong trade-off. The real trade-off is we need to think about our demographic future, which means that we need to be much more open to immigration. And this will also be our saving grace for our economic and social model. And defense, we need to increase our defense spending. In the 1950s, we had much higher defense spending in relation to GDP than we do now, and we built out the welfare states in Europe. So it can be done. But so that's the kind of argumentation that I think we need to put forward. I'd like to say something about the age of empire.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah,
yes,
is that
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, because the question was really, I think what Minna said, that the EU is perhaps not ready for the age of empires.
Well, and it's very interesting. A year ago, I was in a meeting, and there was a Brazilian academic who was accusing Europe of being imperial, and because of enlargement, and I would take out the accusation, but I think the European Union is imperial in that sense. It's on a voluntary basis, that countries that decide to join. And actually that model is still attractive. And we've been talking a lot about Ukraine, and the earlier panel ended saying, Ukraine at the moment is the best thing for Europe's security. And indeed, I agree with that. But it's very much tied to the fact that Ukraine actually wants to join the European Union. So that sort of model, I think, is still functioning. So it does bear relevance to the way Europe works, but it's based on sets of rules, and which is not the imperial model that Russia is proposing, that China is proposing, and that the US is proposing, which is one based on coercion. And then just going to Terry's point, and maybe connecting back also to the question of political leadership. There's growing evidence from polling that actually Europeans are not happy with this submission to the United States. This is precisely one of those areas in which there is this gap, and in which I think political leaders need to think twice about how they, do their cost-benefit analysis in their policy calculations. But I think the bottom line is that at the moment, political leadership in Europe, the median is basically transatlanticist, and is bottom line probably hoping that after Trump there'll be some, maybe not quite a return to the status quo ante, but something like that. And this is quite simply not the case. And I think it's our job, and those of us who are working on transatlantic relations, among other things, to actually clarify that the deep changes that the US is going through at the moment have, roots. They're rooted in at least the past 20, 30 years of history. Some of those trends we see in Europe as well, but the US has some very distinctive ones, divisions over race, religion, etc. But we're going towards a deeply polarized United States and deep polarization in several European countries. And this is really going to upend our politics. And so if European leaders want to think a little bit about the social and cultural dimension of their choices and how they reflect it in Europe, well, I don't think they're doing that at the moment, and they ought to.
Niklas, the question really was also addressed to you, and Europe, not made for the age of empires and the last bastion of the liberal order. Are we up to the task? Your paper is a little bit hopeful on that.
Yeah, I'm an optimist by nature. But yeah, first I have to stand corrected. I didn't think about Katharina and the youth delegate when I thought about the next generation. And there is hope that also the next generation, of course, will be having a positive mindset about international cooperation. So on EU being up to the task, or Europe, if you want to say, being up to the task, I think there are two aspects to it. One is the mindset, and here I think that the EU needs a change of its strategic culture. The strategic culture in the EU today is not so much focused on really analyzing the threats and think about how to turn this into action with the means that it has at its disposal. And this strategic culture is not just about the traditional security, the hard defense strategic culture, but it's really also about this economic strategic culture. How can the EU, how can the Commission use this economic toolbox that it's developing in the moment to actually engage in this economic competition? And I think there are some really hopeful changes going on already in Brussels right now. We see with the new von der Leyen Commission, for example, DG Trade is not only DG Trade, it's DG Trade and economic security, and they focus much more on these aspects of how can we use our instruments that we have, our economic power, to, well, first of all, safeguard our economic security, but also to build trade partnerships and to engage in this economic power competition. So there are first steps of the European Commission becoming a bit more of a political actor in this game, and this is what I mean with this right strategic culture. And the second aspect is the more material aspect, and I think that also goes towards Terry's excellent question. We need to be able, Europe needs to be able to stand on its own feet militarily, because only in that way it is not always subject to the whims of the White House, regardless of the future presidents. But of course, if I would be an advisor to a prime minister or the Finnish president, I would of course always tell my boss, go there and bow your neck and be really polite, because you don't want to go out there and have a scandal and a disaster that might really reflect bad on your government. But if we have also this military independence, autonomy, then we don't need to be worried so much anymore about how a particular leader in the US or elsewhere feels about these issues, because we don't have to worry about that they pull the security rug away underneath our feet. So this is really an important thing that is being worked on in the moment, but there needs to be more efforts also.
So once we're independent from the protection money or the protection shield. But Oliver, quick comment, and then we'll go to the final leg.
I just wanted to address Minna's second question, which we haven't talked about yet. The EU is the last bubble of the rules-based order. We're at a point where China is obviously positioning itself as the heir to the throne of this order that the US is perceived to have abdicated, and it is trying to reshape that order. We already see that in the UN General Assembly, but we will see it in so many of these bodies, and we're already even seeing it in things like technical standards. And my default assumption would be that a more Chinese-flavoured set of global rules going all the way down to, like the size of a ball bearing would not be very palatable to a lot of the parts of the world that are currently multi-aligned, and they might actually find that the previous incarnation that Europe has stood for is a lot more comfortable for them to be operating in. So that could open up a lot of opportunities for forming a current front. And one thing we haven't talked at all about yet is Europe's deepening relationship with Canada, but also with our friends and partners on the eastern end of Asia, particularly the defense industrial relationships with Japan and South Korea. And I see quite a lot of potential for those to get sort of closer. It's not like we're going to be, expanding NATO across the Pacific anytime soon, but there are a lot of things we can do below that threshold.
Absolutely. The problem with panels like these is that there's so many strands we could delve into, and I would love to, and one would be definitely the question of demography and intergenerational fairness, which we won't have a chance to go into more in depth. But perhaps in the last question or in your last answers, you can touch upon these things, because in future studies, we often find it helpful to think about a desired future in order to perhaps have some building blocks for a vision for the future. So, Rosa, what would be your desired future for Europe in 10 to 30 years?
Well, I mean, I think I kind of hinted at that a little bit when I was talking about rethinking the nature of governance, where you have multi-layered governments with greater empowerment at a local level, bottom-up participation, and where you have a greater injection, to be honest, of expertise. I mean, now it's being, we're in the sort of bad books of a lot of political leaders, but actually, this is a time of great change, so we need a lot more expertise and maybe messy global and regional governance, which might settle at some point at a later point in the future, but that would be, in my view, quite a desirable outcome, which could be a little bit of a counter to the autocratic imperial model that certain great powers are pursuing. I mean, I just feel, we talk about great power rivalry, and this is the new reality, and we need to come to terms with it. But the more we talk about it, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you're actually estimating and undermining all those other forces that do still exist and that could acquire a little bit more agency. So I think that would be my ideal future. I would also like to add a very silly comment, an observation which was made to me once by someone who used to supervise me, and I was like, I've got to do all this fundraising, and how am I going to go about it? And he said, success breeds success. And actually, if we are able to present some examples of successful, public-private partnerships in defense procurement, successful examples of managing, certain kinds of challenges, that will be attractive to others. That will set examples. And I think we need a little bit of that to get the ball rolling. Otherwise, we tend to be, lost in a cloud of despair, where, clinging on to what we have is the only anchor. But actually, we do need to find ways to embrace novelty and change. So I think, very simple idea that success breeds success is actually a way forward. And I would say, this blockage in, this Draghi report with all the policy recommendations, and everybody agrees with them, and everybody says, yes, this is the way forward, and there is way too little movement. Identify where there is a little bit of movement, those areas of success, to present them as models for other areas of success.
Thank you. Oliver.
I'll keep it as quick as I can before we go into the
Thank you very much. Yes.
I don't like the term strategic sovereignty. It sounds like something the French would make up to sell us more Rafale fighter jets. But I think the fundamental thing is that we are going to have to be able to deter Russia on our own, independently of the US, if we have to.
Yeah.
And that is going to be a long transitional process because it's not just about military capabilities, it is about really painful, difficult institutional reforms. That is a 10, 15, 20-year process. And in order to get there, we're going to have to reach some kind of equilibrium in our relations with the US.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Niklas?
Yeah, I also keep it short. So I would say my vision would be a Europe where people want to stay or want to move to fulfill their European dream. You know, a bit what was the American dream before, but with the European dream. And with that goes certain aspects, of course, of having like the economic possibilities, single market, and we discussed all these issues, funding for startups, whatever. But also, of course, the social or the soft power of being in a dynamic and welcoming and forward-looking place. And so that would be the short version.
Fantastic. And before we thank our audience, I would like to ask everyone to stay seated because then we'll have the closing words. But now a massive applause, a big thank you to our fantastic panel.
Well, thank you for making us be optimistic.
Thank you. You did a great job. Thank you. All right. I think we are going to have Hiski here next.
Right. Dear friends, I've got goosebumps, to be honest. All good things must come to an end, and this, of course, applies to Helsinki Security Forum as well. I think instead of trying to summarize the amazing conversations, I will just leave you with one question at the very end of this forum, and that, of course, is what happens next? Future, as was just discussed, is not something that awaits us in the abstract. It is something that is constructed, built, and done through human volition and human effort. And if this is to be even an hour of Europe, let alone the hour of Europe, it means that we need to, all of us, individually and collectively, start working for that better tomorrow for Europe and indeed the whole world, which is, I think, what is at stake here when we talk about these things. At this final hour of this forum, I feel a sense of relief, but also a sense of deep, deep gratitude. This is such a massive undertaking for the Finnish Institute and obviously a collective effort. And therefore, I would like to say quite a few words of thanks to everyone included. And I would like to start, obviously, by thanking our panelists, our speakers, our amazing moderators, the audience, and also the people following the live stream for engaging in these conversations and engaging these arguments. And I've been really, really happy and pleased with the kind of debates we have been having over the last 3 days. I would also like to acknowledge the patron of the forum, the President of the Republic of Finland, Alexander Stubb, and thank you him for the support and obviously honoring the beginning of the forum. I would also like to acknowledge the help that we have received from our steering group, from Klaus Korhonen, Antti Helanterä, Janne Kuusela, Jari Luoto, Anne-Mari Wong-Hämäläinen, Mikko Hautala, and Antti Pelttari. It's been really, really important conversations we have been having through this year to hone the themes and discuss the topics and ensure that we have the best possible forum at hand. Also, and it's reflected that the wall there is a very important list of partners and sponsors that I want to publicly also acknowledge. We simply could not do this thing without the help and support we receive, and we are indeed very grateful for that. We're grateful to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland, the Ministry of Defence of Finland, the the city of Helsinki and its mayor, Daniel Sasonov, and many, many companies as well. Patria, Nokia, VTT, Fortum, Stark, the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, Stora Enso, Outokumpu, and Lockheed Martin. And we are also grateful to Ilta-Sanomat and Hannah Holmen, the Cultural Center, for our collaboration. Finally, as I've already indicated, this is a collective effort on the part of almost all FIIans, and I want to pay public tribute and say how amazingly happy and proud I am to be the leader of the FIIA pack. It's an amazing institution, it's an amazing group of people. It is not a place, but it is a process, ongoing, humming beehive with an amazing heart, and it's really a great privilege to be standing here today. So I want to thank for planning, preparations and organization beforehand and during the forum, all the hard work that basically none of you got to see because everything went so smoothly. So Kirsi, Anni, Maija, Matti, Mona, Anna K, Anna L, Marlena, Maiju, Johanna, Mary and Olli. Thank you so very much. Also I want to acknowledge the contributors to our report, Matti again, Jyri, Joel, Tune, Rihor, Arkadi, Kristiina and Lisa. And I also want to thank the FIIans on stage, Markus, Federica, Iiro, Sinikukka, Niklas and Mikael. And last but not least, and I'm now trying to scan the horizon, yes, I want to acknowledge our conference director, Kukka-Maria Kovski. I think we can all agree that, well deserved, richly deserved. I think we can all agree that Helsinki Security Forum is a great thing, and usually great things have many fathers, but this forum can have only one mother, and that would be you, Kukka, for your indispensable work and role and leadership. And I would kindly ask you to raise and take a bow, and so we can properly thank you and everyone else, you included. Finally, one subplot in this year's forum has been the need to scan the horizon, try to not only look at the soles of our shoes or the tips of our toes, but to look into the future and try to see what is the world that awaits us. Lunch is something that awaits us, but I see something even further in the horizon when I try to look far enough, and that would be, of course, Helsinki Security Forum 2026. So I very much welcome all of you to attend the forum in a year's time again, and I thank you once again from the bottom of my heart for this amazing experience. Thank you ever so much. Safe travels and see you soon again.